She stood before the world like a woman whom fate had broken so deeply that any attempt to understand her pain felt like trying to touch burning metal. Her face carried the shadows of sleepless nights, and beneath her eyes were traces of tears she might have shed in the dark or maybe carefully painted on in the morning before walking into the courtroom, where every movement, every breath, every glance became part of a performance. She looked like someone carrying a weight no person could possibly bear, as if her heart had cracked in half the moment life decided to take everything from her. But beneath that image hid something else, not weakness but calculation, not pain but a cold, precise confidence that if she acted carefully enough, beautifully enough, convincingly enough, the world would believe her again, or at least pretend to. Her name was Diana Lovejoy, and only a few years earlier no one would have imagined that her name would appear in the news next to the words attempted murder, ambush, shooting, and conspiracy. To friends and acquaintances, she had been the woman who spent far too long dreaming of a child, far too long trying to build a family, far too many years moving between clinics, medical tests, hopes, and disappointments. She was someone who dedicated herself to the idea of motherhood, and when that dream finally came true, it seemed as if life had settled back into place. But the reality was far darker than the picture she showed the world. What began as a struggle for happiness slowly turned into a struggle for power, for control, for the ability to shape the fate of one single person, her own son. Greg Mulvihill, her husband, saw things differently. He watched the woman he had once chosen change, grow distant, close herself off, and more often interpret the world not as it was but as she wanted it to be. He said Diana didn't just try to control everything around her, she demanded that reality bend to her expectations. If Greg's words were true, the divorce became not just an unpleasant chapter of life, but a full-scale war. She accused him of everything. He accused her of manipulating. She spoke of fear. He spoke of lies. And in the middle of this war stood a child, the only person both of them were willing to fight for until their last breath. When the divorce escalated, Diana began telling others she was afraid of Greg, that he was dangerous, that he might hurt her. She built an aura of victimhood around herself, and people believed her because she knew how to tell a story in a way that made others see the world through her eyes. But eventually words stopped being enough. She needed someone who would believe her so completely that he would follow her into any scenario, even one far beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior. And such a person appeared, Weldon McDavid. He was a firearms instructor, a former military service member, a man of discipline and conviction. In his videos, he taught women how to protect themselves, how to handle weapons, how to act with a cold head. And most importantly, he listened. When Diana told him that Greg was threatening her, he believed her. When she said she was afraid of losing her son, he believed her. When she cried, describing how unbearable life with her ex-husband had become, he believed her. And the more he believed, the easier it became for her to push farther, step by step, leading him toward what prosecutors would later call one of the strangest conspiracies ever seen in a family dispute. The plan didn't form overnight. It grew like a snowball rolling downhill. First came conversations about safety, then about hidden threats, then about Greg supposedly storing dangerous materials, allegedly blackmailing her, allegedly planning to take the child forever. These claims existed only in her words, none of them was ever confirmed. But Weldon wasn't an investigator. He was a man who desperately wanted to be needed, and she knew exactly how to use that. Night after night, they discussed options, soft ones, harsh ones, cautious ones, extreme ones, and at some point, the conversations stopped being just conversations. They became a plan, detailed, thought out, with a chosen location, time, weapon, and escape route. A canyon on the outskirts of town, a dark place without streetlights or cameras. A place where someone could hide in an ambush. A place where a person walking the trail wouldn't hear, wouldn't sense, wouldn't understand until it was too late. Diana knew Greg would agree to meet if he was convinced it involved their custody battle. She called him. Intermediaries called him. The story sounded convincing. Supposedly there was important information he needed to pick up. supposedly tied to emails, supposedly something that could help him in court. Everything looked logical. Everything looked safe. And Greg, not suspecting a setup, agreed to go. That night, he drove to the canyon with a friend. They talked about the case, about how hard divorce can be, about how a child is the most important thing. Neither of them imagined that somewhere ahead, hidden in the darkness, stood a man with a gun. A man who had come there with only one purpose: to kill. They got out of the car, walked along the trail. The beam of the flashlight sliced through the air, sliding across bushes, rocks, dust. And then it paused on something strange. A black shape. A silhouette. Something the brain doesn't recognize immediately because it refuses to accept the truth. And here is where we have to stop, because the next seconds unfolded so quickly, so sharply, so inexplicably, that even Greg later said, "I didn't understand what happened at first," but he did recount it in court. And his words became one of the key pieces of evidence proving that the conspiracy was real and that its execution was lethally precise.
So after I shined the light on it and I stopped for a second to look at it, and it took a few seconds to register what I was looking at, and about the time I realized what I was looking at, it felt like I had been hit in the back, which was confusing to me because I knew I was looking at a gun, but it felt like somebody hit me in the back. And the next thing I remember was starting to run.
When you ran, were you running as fast as you can?
Yes.
Were you and Jason running side by side, or do you know where he was?
I could see Jason, and he was probably 30 or so feet ahead of me, heading back towards the car. And while we were running, I heard about 6 more rapid gunshots.
What happened in that moment felt like a fictional movie scene, but it was real. A person looks at a weapon, realizes a barrel is pointed at them, and doesn't hear the shot, only feels the impact in their back. Adrenaline surges instantly. The brain stops analyzing sound, distance, trajectory. It forces the body to run, because running is the only chance to stay alive. 6 shots behind him, 6 attempts to kill, 6 signals that the person standing in the darkness had not come there to talk, but to end someone else's life. And if the angle had been slightly different, if the distance had been shorter, if Greg had turned his head just 1 second later, this story would have ended not in a courtroom, but at a gravesite. When Greg reached the car, his head thrown back, trying to understand how far the shooter was, how close death was, how quickly help was coming, he still didn't grasp the most important thing: he had survived. And that was exactly what saved the case. The man who was supposed to lose his life in the canyon returned home after treatment, and now every phrase, every memory, every impression became part of what the police would unravel step by step. Investigators started with the ambush site empty, dark, isolated. They found bullet marks, shoe prints, and pieces of equipment that only someone with training could have left behind. This wasn't a random thug or a person who had bought a gun yesterday and decided to try being a killer for the first time. The shooting style was professional, the position chosen precise. These are things done by someone who knows how, someone who trained, someone who knows exactly what he is doing. Investigators examined everyone who might be connected to Diana, and one person lit up as a red flag: Weldon McDavid. He was known as an instructor, as a former Marine, as someone who taught women how to defend themselves and how to shoot. He recorded videos about law enforcement, about firearm safety, about training. He preached discipline and caution. And this man found himself at the center of a story where nothing smelled like safety. When the police came to him, he couldn't withstand the pressure. Not completely, but enough. He began mixing up his stories, saying he had just tried to help, that he never meant harm, that he did what he believed was right. But investigators knew those are the words of people who feel the truth closing in and try to hide their weakest point: motive. And Diana had a motive. They examined her phone, reviewed her calls, looked at what she searched, what she wrote, whom she contacted. They found conversations that made their blood run cold. Diana had told Weldon that Greg threatened her, that he was dangerous, that he could take the child away. But the most frightening part was that all of these claims were baseless. No reports, no complaints, no documented threats. Only words. only emotions, only control. Investigators grew increasingly convinced. Diana had created an enemy in her mind, and if that enemy existed only in her perception, then eliminating him must have seemed to her like a natural solution. Meanwhile, Weldon emerged as the main executor of the ambush. He admitted he had been in the canyon. Not fully, not directly, but enough to assemble the puzzle. He said he had only been helping. He said he had decided to be there. He said he thought everything would work out. But gunshots are not everything worked out. They are an attempt at murder. And the court saw that instantly. When the case moved into the courtroom, Diana did what she had always done best. She created an image. She entered quietly. She lowered her eyes. She hid the trembling of her hands in the folds of her clothing. She kept taking deep breaths, as if trying to hold inside emotions that were about to burst out. She spoke softly, without sharpness, without aggression. She told the court she only wanted to protect her son, that she never asked anyone to harm Greg, that she didn't know what was happening, that the situation spun out of control. She created an atmosphere in which it seemed everyone had simply misunderstood her, that she was a victim drawn into events far bigger than herself. But a case is not an atmosphere, it is facts. And the prosecution laid them out one by one. They said she met with Weldon far too often at critical moments. They said she had been the one to initiate discussions about protection. They spoke of the financial trail of the fact she had been willing to pay for the service. They spoke of planning of the canyon map, of routes, of timing, and most importantly, they spoke of motive, of how Diana was willing to do anything to gain custody, to remove Greg from the equation, to start life with a clean slate, free of the person who inconvenienced her. The court listened. The jurors listened. People in the gallery looked at Diana and at some point realized that this quiet woman, who chose her words so carefully, did not look like someone who could orchestrate an attempted murder. But the truth does not need to look the way we expect. Sometimes the quietest mask hides the loudest intent. And then the moment came when Diana was asked to speak, to give her final words before the jury retired to deliberate. She lifted her eyes. In her gaze mixed fear, desperation, and an attempt to retain control. And she spoke. She spoke as if the court before her was not a court at all, but a group of people she needed to convince that she was good, that she was a mother, that she was a victim. These were the words spoken in that courtroom, recorded, preserved, and forever woven into the case.
I'd never be able to do that. And it's so painful that some people in this world seem to think that I would have it in me to do this.
I thought of my son growing up without a father. My father was killed. My father was killed when I was 24, and I still haven't gotten over that. I would not take a father from a child.
Words that might have sounded touching in another context came across in that courtroom as a carefully rehearsed speech, where every shift in tone, every breath, every pause was arranged with one purpose: to evoke sympathy. She said she had loved Greg, but sitting in front of her was a man who had been shot in the back with a 9mm round. She said she had been fighting for her son, yet the plan she helped set into motion nearly left that little boy without a father. She said she would never hurt anyone, yet just hours before the attempt, she had been messaging the very man who lay in ambush, waiting to kill her child's father. Those words did not sound sincere. They sounded like an attempt to survive when the shallow water around you has turned icy and the lifeline has long since sunk. But now only one stage remained: the verdict. The jurors left the room. The silence that followed was so dense it felt as though the air itself had thickened. Diana sat motionless, as if afraid to move. Weldon did the same, and Greg looked straight ahead, because there was nothing behind him to look back at. He had left too much there, in that night, when he had nearly lost his life. When the jurors returned, the gallery seemed to sink into their seats. The judge lifted her eyes to the sheet of paper and read what would now stay with Diana forever.
Verdict. We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Diana Jean Lovejoy, guilty of the crime of attempted murder of Greg Mulvihill in violation of Penal Code Section 664/187, paren A, paren 1, as charged on count 2. Verdict. We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Weldon K. McDavid, guilty of the crime of conspiracy to commit murder.
All right, we're going to need to take a break. You're down. And if we could have, the jury go back.
And this was the moment the entire world saw. A second after the word guilty, Diana tries to inhale, then to exhale. Then she loses control of her body. She slowly falls backward. Her face turns pale. Her eyes roll back. She collapses from her chair onto the floor like someone hit by an electric shock. Noise ripples through the courtroom. Someone calls for medics. Someone recoils. Someone watches as if unable to believe their own eyes. But one thing matters. This was not a faint from terror. It was the collapse of her mask. The mask she had worn for years, the quiet woman, the victim, the mother who had been fighting for her child. All of it ended the moment the court spoke her true role, a person who had tried to orchestrate the murder of her own husband. The court sentenced her to a long prison term. Weldon received one as well. And Greg walked out of the courtroom, taking steps that no longer echoed with pain in his back, but with something else, the realization that he survived to tell the truth. And the truth prevailed, where lies tried to become the main script. This is not a story about divorce, not a story about jealousy, and not a story about fear. This is a story about how far a person can go when they are terrified of losing control, and how quickly the world collapses for someone who tries to rule reality as easily as their words. Diana Lovejoy did not cry that evening because she had been found guilty. She cried because, for the first time in many years, the world she built on lies stopped working. The truth still caught up with her. And in that courtroom, where she tried to look like a victim, it became clear to everyone, the victim was not her. The victim was the man she had tried to take away from this world.